I think to address this issue, it's very important to understand the fashion industry within the context of the global economy and how this sector is woven into the fabrics of our lives. So no pun intended. The fashion industry represents a significant part of our economies, with this multi-billion-dollar industry employing an estimated 1 in 8 workers globally. So that's just to show the scale of the fashion industry. And we've seen that the sector has experienced rapid growth over the past decades, but we're also seeing increasing attention on the impacts that the industry is having on people and planet. Fashion industries and businesses within the fashion sector are now being called out, of course, for poor labor conditions, child labor issues, accelerating greenhouse gas emissions, depletion of water resources and stocks, and degradation of the natural ecosystems. But we also realize that these impacts they highlight many of the dependencies that the sector has on natural resources. So we know that the fashion industry is heavily reliant on industries, of course, like agriculture, mining, forestry, for all the raw materials that it provides, including things like cotton, wool, and plastics. Therefore, protecting the natural system, which supports these industries, is very key to securing, of course, the supply chains and building the economic resilience within the fashion businesses. But to directly answer your question and come back to this UN report, we know that fashion industries are having to navigate a very complex system, as I've just explained, with how much they are woven into the fabric of our lives. They have highly fragmented and complex supply chains, and the impact of their direct operations to a certain extent is not always reflected in the full supply chains, which has enabled many of the fashion businesses to a certain extent avoid some of the scrutiny and pressure to decarbonize than other major emitters have faced in the past decade. But I think what we know that what you can't manage, you can't measure. And fashion businesses, like I mentioned, have very little transparency over the emissions of their full supply chains. And this is one of the reasons why they're struggling to really understand how to address these issues, not only within their direct operations, but along the supply chains. So generally, we think that there is a lot to be done to help them understand the emissions, but also the impact and dependencies on nature within their businesses and operations, as well as their supply chains. But there's also a strong element of accountability that is needed. And we know that, for example, lack of pressure, whether it's from investors or external stakeholders, over these supply chain and business operations to a certain extent has contributed to some of the performances that we've seen in these reports. But to change the course and the trajectory these companies are on and to build long-term resilience to climate change and nature loss, the industry now needs to shift towards circular and regenerative business models with changes that need to happen at all stages of the value chain and landscapes, starting right from sourcing all the way to the end of life of the fabrics and the products that these companies develop. So from a business per nature perspective, we're currently working with the World Economic Forum, the World Business Council, on what we're calling sector-specific actions, which we'll be launching in September 2023. And the idea is to really support companies to understand what specific actions that they can take now to contribute meaningfully to a nature positive future by 2030. And we're developing one specifically for the fashion chapter, or for the fashion industry. And hopefully these actions can really also spur those very concrete actions that companies within the fashion industry can take now. I think, like I mentioned earlier, the fashion industry is heavily dependent on fibers and other plant and animal materials, things like fresh water, soil health, and energy. So we realize how important nature is to the sector. As a result, they are also heavily reliant on other sectors like agriculture, mining, because they provide the raw materials for then fashion to process for the fashion products. Therefore, I think progress within the fashion sector to decarbonize and to contribute to a nature positive is to a certain extent coupled and dependent on the progress of these sectors as well. And that has been a very major challenge for many of the fashion companies. Not to say that they themselves don't have to do anything, but because of their strong dependence on some of the heavier industries which their supply chains are coupled with, it's made it very difficult. But at the same time, we also realize that the fashion industry is also making a lot of progress. And I think that is important to highlight. I think if you look back 10, 15 years ago and looking at some of the big challenges that they're facing, the fashion industry with leading businesses are working with organizations to drive meaningful changes right from the beginning of their supply chain through retail to end of life of their product. And we're seeing the beginnings of some of the recommendations, whether that is, technology improvements or circular economy models that are being implemented. But now really is the time, looking at the urgency that we have to drive concrete action towards a nature positive net zero economy. Now is the time to take bold action to reverse degradation and biodiversity loss. And I think there's a real opportunity for the sector to reduce its negative impacts and also foster a more circular approach by building resilience and circularity into their business models, like I mentioned. Generally, I think there's a lot to be learned. We've worked with, companies from different industries, but I think one cross-cutting thing that I will highlight is the point around radical collaboration. We realized that what has worked across multiple industries is when companies from the same industry, or sometimes even across different industries, work together and collaborate to drive action. So businesses within the fashion and sector need to work together and create that critical mass of change that will drive markets and value chains towards nature positive models. And we've already seen, emerging initiatives coming up. A very practical example is the Fashion Pact, which is a global initiative of companies in the fashion and textile industry, including their suppliers, distributors, so working along the value chain and all committing to a common core of a common core of environmental goals to stopping global warming, restoring biodiversity, and of course, protecting oceans. So this is a very practical way we're working together within the industry, but also along supply chains. We can, work towards stopping some of these huge global issues such as climate change, nature loss, and protection of our oceans. So I think in order to also make sure that the transformation is achieved, collaboration is important across the ecosystem, but internal business processes must also change. Not just procurement processes, but also some of the day-to-day business decisions that are being made at the C-suite level must consider the impacts of nature, climate, and people. And fashion industries need to take this integrated lens in addressing the serious issues that they currently face. And this is also another interesting question, because I think accountability is critical, is needed to drive credible business action from companies. It is also needed to drive some of the investor decision-making and to a large extent give the public confidence that companies are actually doing what they're saying and they're putting their actions behind the commitments that they're making. So since the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the direction of travel for regulation has been set and is very clear. We need to get to a nature positive future by 2030, and governments will now need to require businesses to take actions for us to get there. We've seen the emergence of regulations all over the world, but I think the most notable, perhaps the most advanced, is at the EU level, where in January already the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, also known as the CSRD, and some of the corresponding European sustainability reporting was already entering into force. Now, these new standards will represent some of the most advanced sustainability reporting frameworks that we currently have. To a certain extent, that will be the North Star for a lot of other jurisdictions to also follow. Another thing that is noteworthy is the fact that the EU Parliament recently supported the inclusion of the most serious environmental crimes to be condemned under EU law. And we've seen the emergence of conversations around, ecocide, and businesses are starting to also quite seriously look at the implications of these regulations for them within the context of how accountable that they will need to be towards nature protection. So, of course, forward-looking companies can already get ahead of this curve by preparing for the policy landscape that is shifting towards regulation that values nature, people, as well as sort of financial performance. To sort of support the transition, we are also seeing the emergence of voluntary frameworks being developed to help companies think through the complexity, because this is a very complex landscape for companies, even companies within the fashion industry, to deal with. So initiatives like the Science-Based Targets Network is helping companies set science-based targets for nature. And the upcoming task force on nature-related financial disclosures, also known as the TNFD, they will be releasing their recommendations in September 2023. And that will enable companies to integrate nature into their decision-making and ensure that they're disclosing the right information to financial institutions and regulators. So I think the question was, do we need more? I think we're getting to a place where we are getting the right frameworks for accountability in place. And I think that is already a good sign for what is to come. Companies just need to get ahead of it. We need to start now. We can't wait for all of these to be in place. I think this is a question that also needs to be, discussed within the right context, and I would need to put my proper English hat on because, organic practices means that it requires farmers to meet a specific set of requirements around things like soil health, the use of different types of artificial fertilizers, harmful pesticides, genetically modified organisms, also known as GMOs, and practically promoting the use of the most organic methods of farming of natural resources that go into the fashion industry. So organic practices are naturally preferred over other traditional farming practices, but the challenge is that, they do not necessarily address the issues past degradation of the land from the agricultural sector, which is why the concept of regenerative agriculture is emerging as also an important one within the context of getting to a nature positive future, where we want to not only halt the loss of biodiversity, but also start to restore and reverse nature loss. So regenerative agriculture takes a more conservation and rehabilitation approach, for example, by preventing nature degradation, but also improving soil health and biodiversity, removing carbon, and in total, increasing the resilience to climate change. So yeah, the regenerative fashion movement, I think, is growing rapidly. And we've seen lots of companies in and out of the fashion and sector. But I think just to name a few, companies like Patagonia, Island Fisher, Burberry, the Kering Group, owners of Gucci and others, are some of the companies that are starting to look at regenerative agriculture and regenerative farming practice very seriously, committing and working with farmers to adopt some of these practices within their supply chains. And I think the conversation needs to be couched within the long-term goal of the global biodiversity framework, which is the fact that we're trying to halt biodiversity loss, but also a strong focus on recovery and regeneration, to make sure that at some point we're building again the natural stock. And I think that is where regenerative becomes really important to the equation. To a certain extent, that is the elephant in the room, right? We face this question all the time around whether growth is, compatible with nature protection. We do know that the current business models in the fashion industry do not necessarily facilitate the achievement of a nature positive future. At this current rate, value creation is very strongly coupled with the extraction of new resources to make new products. And I think fundamentally that must change. Secular businesses and secular business models for the fashion industries will be a significant opportunity to reduce the sector's impact and dependencies on nature. Adopting circular business models does not necessarily mean sacrificing revenue, but rather finding a way to decouple this growth from the raw material production, and to a certain extent, even unlocking new revenue and additional value from the same product, right? So this involves already designing out some of the waste, some of the pollution, and planning for longevity, durability, recyclability, and also reusability, so that you can get multiple returns from the same product. So I think, ultimately, that is the trajectory that sustainable fashion should be heading towards. And I think that will be sort of the answer to this question. I'll begin and I'll preface this question by saying that there are fundamental actions that all companies should need to take to address nature loss. And at the beginning of last year, Business for Nature, in collaboration with a few of our key partners, came up with what we call the high-level business actions. Companies will need to assess their impact and dependencies, commit to science-based targets, take very concrete transformative actions, and then disclose using the relevant frameworks to the right stakeholders. So of course, that becomes the high-level framing for what every company that wants to contribute towards a nature-positive future should do: assess, commit, transform, and disclose. But specifically for the fashion sector, we're thinking about specific transformative actions that will have an impact if they do. And the first one that I'll highlight is that fashion companies will need to avoid and reduce the use of high impact or uncertified materials. So they will need to, identify more sustainable materials, explore other low impact alternatives, follow sustainability standards, and really implement some of the traceable and responsible sourcing policies. The second one to highlight is around the need to reduce and avoid, to a certain extent, the use of hazardous chemicals across your supply chain. And to do this, they need to conduct really thorough assessments and control the use of hazardous chemicals through the manufacturing process. Companies will also need to restore degraded land and move towards more, again, regenerative agricultural practices to make sure that they're giving back more, sometimes even more than what they're taking from the soils, from the resources. And they need to work with partners, conservation experts, local communities, and recreate the conditions necessary for natural recovery of soils, vegetations, and wildlife. And then lastly, of course, I mentioned this earlier, but just to iterate, transforming business models and building for circularity. I think we can't hammer that enough. We need to decouple company value creation from extraction of new materials and new resources, and start considering the entire life cycle of products, engaging with suppliers, local government, consumers, and really bringing the community together. I think this requires a strong mindset shift to make sure that, you know, your suppliers understand that they need to already design products, raw materials for circularity. Your customers need to also understand the importance of, you know, bringing products back for recycling, for reuse, for upgrading, etc. So I think these 4 actions are critical. And while they're critical for mitigating the nature and climate risks faced by the fashion industry, they also could actually help raise a huge commercial opportunities. I think there's an estimate by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation of around 560 billion potential gains that could be made if companies are really taking these actions. Like I mentioned earlier, Business for Nature, we're currently working on developing these concrete sector actions with one focus on fashion, which we'll be launching in New York in September 2023. And we'll be able to provide even further clarity on the impacts, dependencies, but most importantly, on the specific actions that companies within the fashion sector can take and what they should prioritize now. Lots of great questions. I think all companies face different challenges in the transition that is needed. Indeed, large companies have, you know, more leverage with their suppliers to engage them and encourage them to adopt either regenerative or sustainable practices, while some of the smaller ones also have perhaps less complicated supply chains. So even with the, you know, smaller resources, they're able to take more swifter actions and are more nimble. I think I mentioned earlier already the Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, but it's important to reference that again here, because that specific target distinguishes between large businesses, SMEs, taking a more prescriptive approach for the large companies, but it also recognizes the need for a different approach for smaller companies who have less capacities and need additional support, incentives from the government to be able to comply, for example, with that target. So I think in that context, large companies would be expected, you know, large companies who have longer supply chains and work very closely with SMEs will be expected to provide additional support and capacity to some of the SMEs in their value chains. A very good example that I can think of the top of my head, VF Corporation, which includes brands like Timberland, Vans, and the North Face. They're partnering with sort of rubber producers in Thailand to pilot some of the industry's first regenerative rubber supply chain. And this partnership is already seeing farmers transitioning from, you know, current monoculture systems and transitioning towards agroforestry production that aims to improve soil health by already incorporating, for example, multiple trees to mimic the natural forest ecosystem rather than replicating, you know, the current monoculture planting of rubber trees. And these are examples of how large companies are collaborating with smaller companies within their supply chains. So again, just to come back to the initial question of, you know, whether one type of company has it harder, I think they have very different challenges. And again, I think it comes back to the point around collaboration, not only within the ecosystem, but also along value chains, along landscapes. I think it's only when we have that collaboration going that, you know, all these companies in the fashion industry can move together towards a nature positive future.